Hi all, I'm going to start my presentation now. I'll just give you a kind of a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about now, and I'll start, I suppose, with just a little bit about this presentation. So I've been asked by Cora to do a 20 minutes to 25-minute talk about Agile and some of the myths debunked based on the experiences that I've had. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the floor and let some questions be asked. I hope you can all hear me here. So I suppose just giving me a little bit of a background on myself. I started my career as I came out of university as a mechanical engineer with an information systems postgrad. I started very much in a kind of a waterfall-based environment where we had our own internal proprietary processes, procedural languages, assembler code and stuff like that. And I suppose I was involved in the 2G to 3G race, and I was involved in like UML before it was, when it was like 0.7, before it became 1.0 and so on. I worked with Jacobson and Ericsson's who proposed the use cases. I was involved in very much in the late 90s in the iterative and incremental movement, rapid application development, pair programming, which led to extreme programming. I was involved in feature-driven development. I did a lot of work with kind of architectural design as well, and I suppose when the Agile Manifesto came out in 2001, I was what I would describe as an anti-Agile person, and I'll explain why I was of that, and now I'm very much an advocate of Agile. So before I start into this, I suppose I get the pleasure of going down through a number of different things, and one of them is that I get to talk about a guy called Henry Lawrence Gant, or at least I need to get a chance to raise your awareness of this man. And then I'll just give you a few little statistics on Agile, and then I'm going to debunk about 5 myths today. So the first one is that Agile is not you. The second one is that you sacrifice your design or your architecture over your code. The third one is that there's poor documentation produced in Agile. The fourth one is that there's no planning with Agile, and then the fifth one then is that Agile can only be used in software-based projects. So I suppose I get to start with one of my heroes, and it's Henry Lawrence Gant, a mechanical engineer. You can get to see here's a picture of Henry here. I suppose for some of the things that you don't understand is the reason that I actually mentioned this guy at this moment is on the 6th of April 1917 the US entered the war to end all wars in World War I. And what most people don't understand is that the US went into World War I equipped with a new weapon, and that new weapon was the Gant chart. It had never been used before. It had only been developed by Henry Gant a couple of years beforehand. And when one of the colonels was John T. Thompson, who invented the Thompson gun, when he was getting his Distinguished Service Medal, he sent the medal to Gant and said, this would not have been possible without having the Gant chart behind us. So Henry Lawrence Gant was a massive influencer out there in the world of project management. He was the person who created the Gant chart. He was the person who looked at industry efficiency algorithms. He looked at the tasks and the bonus systems, and he had a deep sense of social responsibility of what businesses needed to do, for their staff and stuff like that. And I've actually included one of his original Gant charts here that you can actually see here. And why do I even mention this guy, and why do I even say it? Well, obviously it's the centenary year, but also an awful lot of the things that Gant was trying to do. And remember, these Gant charts were used then in the Hoover Dams, the interstate projects. They have been used the whole way through over the last 100 years. Is that an awful lot of the vernacular that Gant used and an awful lot of the problem solving that he used is very similar to what we're actually trying to do in Agile. And in Agile, we still have the equivalent of a Gantt chart, which we can call them sprint burn-down charts. We still do percentage completes. We still have risks and issues. These are things that Gant would have been talking about. We definitely do have efficiency algorithms inside Agile, things like team velocity, the task and the bonus system. Things are broken down into ethics and user stories. So there still is a strong link to all project management. So Agile is still a project management practice. It's still a strategy for project management. So let's not forget a little bit about some of the older guys like Gant, guys like Brunel and so on. And I suppose then I'll talk a little bit then just about the Agile Manifesto. So on February the 11th to the 13th in a hotel called the Lodge at Snowbird. There was a grouping of 17 what they called themselves as organizational anarchists, which were some of the greatest minds from the late 90s, came together into the ski resort up in Utah. It's interesting that they weren't snowboarding or skiing, but this is what actually came out of it. What came out 2 or 3 days later was the Agile Manifesto. And who were these kind of guys that were involved in this? These were like heavily influencers from the late 90s. So you had guys like Ward Cunningham, who was doing patterns and object-oriented programming, CRC design methods. One of my personal favorites, guys like Martin Fowler, who was doing stuff on analysis patterns, distilled UML, refactoring. You had Alistair Cockburn, who'd written a lot of books on Crystal and on the Crystal family of agile methodologies. You had Kent Beck, who was the creator of extreme programming, and so on and so on. So these were some brilliant guys that came together. And the types of things that they were saying that they came out of, and I suppose it's when you look at this manifesto, you can actually begin to see why some of the myths have come from this. And I use George Orwell as a quote here, because if you look at the things that they were actually saying is that you break the team into self-organized cross-functional teams, and these guys make their own decision-making processes and so on. And the next thing was that you use people people and their interaction over the processes and tools. I mean, this was wide-scale anarchy when we had such strong tooling that was coming out, tooling and processes like the rational unified process and IBM getting involved in it. This concept that individuals and interactions was more important than the process and tools. That was scary stuff to come out at the particular time. They also were saying things like, you know, embrace change. Do work on the software over the documentation, you know. So, and this is one of the myths that I will actually come up with then as well as to try and debunk it, is the fact that if they explicitly stated this down of working your software over documentation, then people who were from the document-centric or waterfall process suddenly got a little bit nervous. Other things that they were involved in is fundamentally spend more time writing your code than you do spending time doing up documentation. And embrace change, do adaptive planning, do faster delivery, and of course build in continuous service improvement into all of this as well. So with that, what are some of the principles of Agile? So developing things into iterations, into smaller iterations called sprints. Building and releasing your software often. Most of the projects that I have been, most of the Scrum projects that I've been involved in, we do a full build at the end of every sprint, which is at the end of every 2 to 3 weeks. Get your requirements to evolve over time, but remember that the time scale is actually fixed. With requirements, you don't do up these heavy-duty requirement specification documents. You do up kind of more wireframes and epics and user stories, which have different types of scenarios. You get your user involved in the process. Remember, users used to be some, you know, people that would only get the code at the very end of the process. If you're following good Agile, what you'll actually have is that you'll get your users heavily involved in the sprint, not in the sprint planning, but in the inputs to the sprint planning, and also in the show and tells and retrospectives that you'll do afterwards. So, and then like other types of things is, you know, put your testers in as part of the actual sprint teams, you know, so test early and test often, you know, focus on your frequent deliveries and so on. But these are the tenets, these are the principles of Agile. So you can actually begin to see why some people are actually, you know, some organizations are scared to actually use Agile because, you know, developing documentation is something that they've been traditionally doing for long periods of time. Or if you're saying give kind of collaboration over to your developers, some people would have like the experience that developers, you know, don't flourish in an interpersonal, you know, in interpersonal relationships and so on. So what we've got here then is, and I would recommend that people who are on this call will actually go and look at it. I've been reading this report every year for the last 10 years. Version 1 come out with a state of Agile every year. I mean, the first thing on this is that it's actually, they gather quite a large amount of participant data, and they are practitioners of Agile. This year's one, the 2016 one, was based on 3,880 participants. So The stats speak for themselves. I mean, the first thing on it is that of the organizations that version 1 actually interviewed, what they had is 94% of them practice some form of Agile. That's a phenomenal figure. 24% of the respondents have been using Agile for the last 5 years. And I went back just to kind of juxtapose it against like some of the 2013 or 2012 results, and this percentage of organizations, so 25% of organizations that were interviewed by version 1 have been practicing Agile for greater than 5 years. Why are they doing this? And the main reasons that they're doing this is to accelerate the product delivery and also to their ability to managing the changing priorities. And you can see the percentage on it. And the benefits of this. So this is the organizations that are coming back and saying, here, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, is that 87% say that the chief benefit of this is to manage changing priorities. So they're doing something right inside the actual Agile process, inside the requirements process. Team productivity is another key benefit of this, and that's because you actually know through your stand-up meetings, you know what you did yesterday, what you're doing today, and if there's any blockers or issues. And productivity, then you can start working on what your resource productivity is from coders, which you couldn't do in earlier kind of waterfall or early iterative and incremental processes. You get good visibility of the project. Remember, it was the days of, like in the 90s, where the coders would go off, they'd disappear into the dark rooms, and then they would reappear with the code. In this case, with sprint planning and with show and tells and with retrospectives, you get much better visibility of what's actually going on inside the projects. So I suppose this one is an interesting and a kind of a fun one to actually go at. Every paper that you read will always talk about how Agile is new. It's not new. I tell my nieces and nephews that Agile, or that man didn't actually learn how to fly till 1903, and we went to the moon in 1969. And with the speed of where our technology is actually going, to talk about something that it's been around for the last 16 years, this is definitely not a new process or a new methodology at this stage. And we got to remember that it was from those great minds, from those 17 guys, from the Agile Alliance that came together, that it's built on the foundation of all the processes that have come before. And like the types of processes that were coming before, I've mentioned some of them already, but like things like iterative and incremental, feature-driven development, which ended up in product-driven development, product-driven lifecycle models, pair programming and extreme programming, DSDM, UML, OAD, you know, refactoring, all these things. So Agile was just more of a strategy, a way of bringing together all the practices and all the minds from all the different processes that were out there and saying, this is a new way of putting it all together. And I suppose the things that people need to look at with this is that this is a good thing. For anyone who's thinking about getting involved in Agile right now, or has been involved in Agile for the last 2 to 3 years and they've been struggling, or has been going, certain parts have been going well, one of the things that's quite amazing about Agile right now is the amount of resources that are out there, the amount of case studies that we have out there. And there is expertise. There's a lot of people that can actually, you know, come in that have been involved in different stages of the actual process, that have got like proven experience from the early days of the 90s right through to right now. So leverage off some of that experience out there. So I think this is one of the ones. I was guilty of this myself as somebody who was doing real-time modeling. We were using rational rows RT in the late 90s to do up these UML real-time architectures. So not only could we show a customer an architecture in the diagram, or show our designers and our developers an architecture in the diagram, but we could also start executing and show the actual code running in the background. So when the Agile Manifesto came out, the types of things that I was running around, like a lot of people, running around with my hands in the air saying was, well, the architecture will become brittle, and you'd look seriously at people then, or there's going to be spaghetti code out there, or we need some sort of conceptual models of the structure and the behavior of the system, or of the data of the system. And the reality of it was that it was understandable why this myth was actually there, and it was understandable because we had a very architecture focus in the late 90s. But I think one of the things is that when you look at the Agile Manifesto and you look at what's actually, what's actually said inside the manifesto and what actually happens inside Agile, the reality of it is that the design has never been more important than it is today. And when we talk about design, sometimes what we forget is that we used to think about design as objects and classes and how they interact. Today, when we talk about design, we're talking about the user experience. And the user experience design is so much more important today than it was, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So we take that, and in order to do that, we have to get the user experience over the functionality. We have to do all these user interfaces designs and all these graphic designs. And these should be done either at the start of every sprint, or if there is a grouping of sprints that should be there. Now, there are a huge amount of design tools that are still out there, agile design tools. There's Axure, there's Balsamic, there's one called Fluid UI, which is very good. And these are kind of tools to help improve the collaboration between the designers and some of the rest of the team. And I suppose the types of things that you need to think about a little bit when you get into the design is that there's two types of design that you can do when you're in Agile. One of them is parallel design and one of them is in-sprint design. Obviously the parallel design is where you're getting your design, which is your UI UX designs and your wireframes and all that type of stuff, done in parallel to the actual sprint developments, or you can actually do it inside the sprint in the actual sprint itself. But the reality of this is that if you're starting into a complex, if you've got some sort of complex distributed system, if you've got a lot of kind of users, if you've had problems with user experiences before this, don't forget about the design. Do an upfront architecture, get in an architect in, do an upfront one. Within your sprint teams then, what you need to do is you need to identify somebody who's looking after the particular Scrum team's architecture. In Agile vernacular, you call them solution architects. But don't forget about your actual architecture. There is still a lot of design there, and remember that an awful lot of the final architecture is designed and finessed, and the quality of it is improved during the actual refactoring process. So poor design is not really, it's not something that exists anymore. So the next one that I love, and it's because it actually explicitly states it out, is that it states that, get people's interaction, don't use processes and tools as much, don't produce as much documentation. So it actually explicitly states it out in the Agile Manifesto. The reality of it is that you still need documentation. So if you look at what we were doing in the late 90s and noughts, we were creating these massive requirement specification documents. There was a lot of repeated information in each requirement spec. Requirement specs took a huge amount of time to actually do. There was product requirement specs and so on. Today, what we actually have is that we've got a much greater efficiency, let's say, in the documentation. So instead of creating all these requirement documents, you create user stories. Instead of creating product descriptions, you create product backlogs. We use epics, we use sprint planning. So the documentation is still there. What we do is that there's a much greater efficiency to this documentation. Let's face it though, the software developers and the techies are poor creating and producing documentation. So what you need to do with this is that you need to kind of, at the beginning of an actual project or the development of an actual system, you need to go and find out from the client or from the users of the system of what is the amount of documentation that they want to have produced. You need to make sure that you actually put a time to the creation of each one of the documents that are wanted. You put a costing or a size to each one of them, and then you start including that in all of your sprints. So there should be a certain period of time to do up user documentation, or to do up training documentation, or to actually do up like supporting documentation, requirement documentation, whatever it is. You need to build that into your actual sprint plans. It's a deliverable, just like the code. I think the difference with Agile is that you actually create more efficient documentation, and there is, without a question or a doubt, less documentation produced along the way. So Another one of the myths that are out there is that there's no planning involved in Agile. So when we look at this, I mean, I don't even know where to say that there's no planning. On the projects that I have been involved in with this for the last 10 years, there's been more planning involved in Agile than we've had in any of the other processes, I suppose. Just to say it, sprints are broken down into two to 3 weeks durations. You've got stories, you know, which are described in short descriptions of the discrete functionality that's being used. You've got to add in your specific acceptance criteria. You've got to use mock-ups and wireframes. You do product backlogs, you have your epics. All of this is actually broken down into where you've got like user story points, or you've got epic points, which are like estimations of ways that estimations that come in from the engineering team or come in from, you know, the product prioritization or from the team velocity. So what you've got is that you've got like really fine-tuned planning is actually going on. So at the start of each sprint, you get your developers into a room, you get your sprint teams into a room for an hour to a couple of hours at the start of it. Every single day you've got a sprint planning meeting where you do things like, what did you do yesterday, what are you doing today, if there's any blockers, any issues. As you get towards, you know, you've got your testers that are involved in the planning process as well. At the end of every sprint, you've got to do things like you've got to make sure that you do your retrospectives, that you do show and tells back to your clients. So what you have inside Agile is that you've got some very strong planning going on, and this planning is happening at a very rigorous daily level. What I think is happening here sometimes out with the Agile world is that sometimes the staff may not have the experience, not in the sizing or not in the scheduling, but in the actual planning of it. So make sure that you, in some cases, that you'll actually bring in a sprint, you know, that you bring in a planning coach in for certain periods of time. And make sure when you're actually doing this. So I think coaching is something that's very, very important in education. And so my recommendation here would be that make sure that you do get your planning correct, because it is one of the key milestones of Agile. And I suppose the last one, based on some of my experience in the last year, is that Agile is only for software-based projects. I do understand when you look at, there was a pharma project that I was looking at there recently that was like 15 to 20 years when you took in all the preclinical trials and human trials and so on into it. It just didn't feel like, when I looked at this particular pharma project, it just didn't look like something that you could use Agile for, where you've got faster deliveries and so on, because you've got regulators, because you've got standards that are actually out there. I think one of the things that I would say with this is that there are some movements that are beginning to happen where Agile is being used inside some of the non-software based projects. I mean, I was using it in some of the ones in telcos. We were using it. We were actually using it. One of the ones that the standards that I came across there recently is the TIR 45, which is for medical devices and for the creation of medical devices, and it prescribes directly how you actually apply Agile and use Agile for, you know, for a non-software based project. And make sure whatever guideline or whatever guideline you're actually using or whatever standard you're following for Agile, make sure that it complies with the IEC, the 62304 standards. So there are just a few. I could go on for a lot longer on this. I'm kind of running out of time here. I see that I'm in 26 minutes into this already. I suppose my concluding comments are projects still fail. And I suppose if you can all kind of read what's coming up here on the screen. I suppose some of the reasons why it would fail is the lack of experience with the Agile method. I suppose the one that's still always there is the company culture and philosophy is at odds. And one of the things that you have is like giving control, like Agile giving control over to design teams and stuff like that. I mean, senior executives struggle with this. And there is a cultural clash with everything that comes up with Agile, and these statistics are showing it there as well, along with the actual management support. And I suppose the last thing is that the barriers to the Agile, I suppose the ability to change the culture, and not enough personnel with Agile experience, and then the organization's resistance to change. I suppose with all of that, I suppose my concluding comment is that Agile with and of itself is only a strategy. It's not a silver bullet. It's a set of guiding principles. You pick and choose the parts that will work for you. You learn from your experiences with it. You don't do a big bang where you totally turn into Agile in the beginning. You do create documentation. You definitely do design and use some of the tools that are out there. Use Axure, use Balsamiq, use Fluid UI, and build design into your actual process. Still have your architecture. Make sure that you're actually doing up your documentation and so on. So with that, I will conclude up this presentation. Thank you so much for your time, and if you have any questions, please reach out to myself or to Kieran, who's on this call. Thanks to Cora for their time, and I look forward to speaking to you all reasonably soon. Thank you.